This is the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 1st Edition Dungeon Master's Guide. In this book, among the rules and advice for game masters, both helpful and questionable, are a variety of appendices. These have everything from random tables for creating your own dungeons and world maps to pages of quick reference tables. Among these is Appendix N, a list of recommended works of fiction that can spur your inspiration as a dungeon master and as a player, included because heroic fantasy and swords and sorcery were not as well known then as it was today. Other RPG books since then, including other editions of D&D, have continued the tradition of providing recommended works of fiction to spur players and game masters, later going on to include television series, comics, and films as well. However, generally, these sections omit works of anime. It's time to rectify that. This is the Anime Appendix N. Hello, and welcome to the inaugural installment of the Anime Appendix N. Or, let me rephrase that. Hello, and welcome to the inaugural installment of the Anime Appendix N. This is a limited series that I'm going to be doing as something of a spin-off of my annual RPG recommendation videos. And this time I'm going to flip the script a little bit. Rather than giving particular RPG recommendations based on certain series or video games or that sort of thing, I'm going to be giving discussions of series that can provide inspiration to help you improve your game. Now, these are going to be system and setting neutral. They are going to be more focused by genre instead, with each video being focusing on a particular genre separately. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what these various series can contribute to your role-playing game campaign, since these videos are kind of more intended for people more on the role-playing game side of things as opposed to anime fans who are maybe new to role-playing games or what have you, that are looking for a recommendation of what to pick up to fit a particular theme of a show that they want to emulate. But yeah, before I get into the nitty-gritty of all this, let's get into some overall questions which will apply for all of these. Specifically, why anime? Why the Anime Appendix N? A lot of Western media, in a general sense, tends to have very limited casts. Even television shows, movies, and fiction from countries that don't have the American focus on rugged individualism still can have very lean, limited casts that are much smaller than you have at the tabletop. Even some of the more iconic lineups of Doctor Who, which has been adapted to role-playing games on multiple occasions, often only have 2 to 3 characters, including the Doctor. However, the average tabletop role-playing game group tends to have somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 players, sometimes even possibly more than that. This gives the added challenge in an RPG group of keeping everyone engaged and also giving everyone's character spotlight moments. Anime and manga series, on the other hand, tend to be more ensemble pieces. Even series with clear cases where there is one person in particular where you consider the lead, like Amuro in Gundam, Naruto in, Naruto, or Ippo in Hajime no Ippo, aka Fighting Spirit, have supporting characters who have significant enough roles and significant enough spotlight episodes or even storylines in their own right to establish them as what I would consider player character roles. Next, anime and manga, particularly because they're long-running works by a single creative team, whether it's just a writer and artist in one with a bunch of assistants, or a writer with a separate artist and their assistants, will be able to get more into the weeds when it comes to setting and world building and maintain a certain degree of consistency. Take, for example, the works of Kinoku Nasu. Between the various visual novels, anime series, and spin-off novels, we have a pretty solid idea of not just how magic works in the Nasuverse, but how the society around magical practitioners is structured and where some points of friction are. Now, all of these works are written by different authors, but there is the central sort of driving creative force of Type Moon and Kineko Nazu in particular. for a even more focused thing than that, in My Hero Academia, they do a pretty solid job of building the idea of how, not just, at least in Japan, how the government of a superpowered society, like the manga and anime setting is structured, but also in turn how that structure creates narrative potential for future stories beyond just your standard superhero-supervillain conflict. And again, because a lot of these novels and manga and animes tend to stick with one creative team driving the work, or again, with the case of Nasu, has a main creative force guiding it, you don't quite get the same degree of awkward retcons that you do tend to get in Western comics. Don't get me wrong, I love Western comics. If you're new to this channel and coming to this just now, check out my video series on recapping the Nightfall Saga, a series which I am enjoying considerably. But the thing is, with even with that series, and the stuff leading up to the Nightfall Saga, there are bits of that made me scratch my head due to the context of this being a long, ongoing series with multiple writers going in this common setting and not necessarily having time to coordinate world developments. For example, I had to scratch my head when it was revealed that Armand Kroll's campaign for mayor of Gotham City was completely unopposed. In fact, I called attention to it in the videos. That's the sort of thing which normally gets a major storyline, like for a superhero series set around a major city, because usually this spills over to other parts of the plot. And even in Gotham, that sort of thing wouldn't necessarily happen in terms of running unopposed. Someone else would want the job. Now, this happens in comics, like with DC and the Nightfall Saga, because someone earlier established that we need a mayor, that the mayoral position had been vacated by a previous author, and because there isn't current time for the current planned storyline and where they need to be when, particularly there's another event all the way at the end of that, which was giving them a sort of deadline, which I haven't gotten into this in those videos, is the case in the Nightfall Saga and 0 Hour, to establish an actually competitive election with various other candidates. Whereas for a singular author, no, I didn't say artist, but author for the manga, for a work, or universe, or what have you, and this could be for a manga writer, or this could be something like Invincible by Robert Kirkman, where it's predominantly his universe, and he's the main writer on that overall. You have, he knows what the pace is. He's not necessarily crossing over with other stuff. Again, sometimes does. Eric Larson with Savage Dragon, for example. And they control the pacing and can determine, okay, I need to establish the mayor at this point. I previously vacated it in this other thing, so I have to give an explanation, and so forth and so on. And I can see if I can fit a story out of this. While long-running fiction is certainly not new to Western television by any stretch of the imagination, it is relatively recent in the history of television where particularly with the rise of streaming media and the ability to get TV shows on DVD, where the structure of the series has focused much more on serialized storytelling instead of episodic television. You still had serialized shows before, but you tended to get stuff that's more along the lines of, say, soap operas, which were more limited budget and sometimes limited in their narrative scope, admittedly part of that being due to the limited budget. Now, those shows would end, they might have some plot developments that would stick from episode to episode, even with sitcoms where you'd have character relationships building or new neighbors or somebody having a kid, but generally episodes will end by returning to some form of the status quo. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But that said, a role-playing game campaign predominantly tends to be more serialized than episodic in terms of how the structure is handled. That said, we've gotten more serialized storytelling in the West over the past few years, particularly with stuff like Stranger Things, like The Walking Dead, like The Expanse, and other shows in that regard. And certainly, anime and manga have had its fair share of episodic storytelling as well. There's no limit to the number of Monster of the Week shows like Mazinger Z, or some of the more filler-heavy areas of Sailor Moon, that sort of thing. But the stuff that tends to get released here does also tend to err more on the side of serialized as opposed to episodic. Even some of the more predominantly slice of life series or even slapstick heavy series can end up being somewhat serialized, like with the development of the various characters in Laid Back Camp. So, if you're looking just for a series of examples of how to structure serialized storytelling, whether it's for a big, long-running epic series, or maybe a short season of television, in terms of the approximate length, or even less than that, with a 1 to 2 to 3 volume manga representing a very short one-shot spin-off campaign, anime and manga makes for a really good example for this. And actually, even then, with the limited run 2 to 3 volume manga series thing, that works better for an adaptation of this form of storytelling than, say, a movie. So, over the course of this series, I am going to be going over some of the major genres of fiction that tended to get adapted into tabletop role-playing games, and I'll be spotlighting various anime and manga that can provide useful tips to game masters and even players to help you improve your game. That is the intent behind the original Appendix N, to spotlight authors and works of fiction that can provide inspiration for Dungeons & Dragons at a time when a lot of the works, when that particular type of fantasy wasn't as permeating the popular culture as it is now. So next time, since I'm calling this the Anime Appendix N, we might as well kick things off with fantasy. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe. And also consider backing my Patreon. Patreon backers get episodes up to 1 week early of this show and any future Let's Plays. Also, please consider backing my Ko-fi. Toss me a few bucks, also helps support the show, and it's not a monthly obligation or anything like that.